because in 1947 and 1949, we passed the National Security Act and the CIA Act, and those two acts in combination allowed money to be clawed out of the federal government and federal budget and spent in non-transparent ways. So we created a secret way of funding very big projects through the governmental mechanism.
Across the globe, our identity is being traded for billions of dollars. How is it possible that something so seemingly elusive as our data has so much value? Data is the new gold, and this is the gold rush. But what does that mean for us? What does it mean for our privacy and for our freedom? Wrapped in a veil of marketing, grand narratives, and noble causes, we are presented with a future which may be less rosy than it appears. The Next Web is one of the world's leading tech events. One of the speakers is the former CIA and NSA contractor, Edward Snowden. In 2013, he blew the whistle on the large-scale spy activities that the US government conducted on citizens and governments worldwide. His message is clear.
The idea that there was a system of global mass surveillance in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, right? The media treated this possibility as a conspiracy theory because they could not see why. When we got the evidence, things quickly began to change, but what threats are we missing today? And I think when we look at what's happening as these post-pandemic restrictions, everybody closes borders instantly, then you've got to install apps and all of these different changes. And then just a few years later, you've got in China, 25 million people in the city of Shanghai who are not allowed to leave their apartments, who are not allowed to even order groceries. If you couldn't leave your apartment and you couldn't order groceries right now, how long would you last? I think this is where we are moving toward a moment in history right now that we all feel things are going wrong. Everybody sees the plate beginning to slip in slow motion. We're all reaching it to try to catch it. But if we had known that plate was going to fall, we would have a better chance to catch it. And I am worried that the plate is going to break. Banks are the biggest example right now where, they can cut you off at any moment. You have your money in their hands, and they're supposed to, be good stewards of it. But we have begun to see people dislocated from their accounts because of protest activity, right? Because of the movements they support. But governments realize they have new tools that they've never had before. When there is such a popularity, when there is such a dependence on a certain structure, on a certain network, how do we leave it? How do we depart it? How do we progress from it? How do we recognize that the system as it exists today is not good enough? And to recognize that it could be better, and to recognize that it should be better, and to recognize that individually and collectively we can make it better. But it will not become better unless we force that to happen. I don't mean violently. This can be achieved non-violently. And I think this is both the great challenge and the great hope of our time. And we are being asked by history in this moment right now, what are we going to do with it?
The digital identity gives us a prospect of convenience, security, and economic progress. But at the same time, there are grave concerns, such as here in Frankfurt, where people are worried about their privacy, safety, and freedom. By connecting every citizen's data, it would be technologically feasible to surveil, manipulate, and exclude people from society on a large scale. A so-called digital wallet will enable various attributes to be incorporated into it, such as government records, insurance documents, travel documents, personal data such as social media accounts, bank records, diplomas, credit card records, medical records, and vaccination status. In the wrong hands, this could become the ultimate means of control. During the 2020 pandemic, we saw how such means can be used to exclude people from society. The plans for a digital ID have been around for much longer, but the corona crisis gave governments free rein to fast-track a QR code ID system as part of the digital COVID certificate. We are entering a new era of extensive governmental control.
There are different paradigms that we enter into as history unfolds and as different events take place. And I think for the past couple of decades, certainly the terrorist events of September 11, 2001 was used as one of those paradigms of control of society and was used as the excuse for the implementation of all sorts of measures that would not have been doable, really, without that justification, that presumed justification.
In response to the attack on the Twin Towers on September 11, 2001, George W. Bush signed the Patriot Act, a controversial bill that would make it easier for the American intelligence agencies to surveil and eavesdrop on citizens on a large scale. The act was to be temporary, but this act has been extended to date in modified form and also has implications for American companies beyond the national borders of the US.
It is now not in the name of some turbaned boogeyman hiding behind some corner who wants to blow you up. Now it's the virus that's hiding behind some corner and wants to infect you. And one of the obvious techno-solutionism answers to this problem is the COVID passports, the vaccine certificates. The specter of this was floated almost immediately in the wake of the lockdowns and other things that we saw in March of 2020. So the vaccine passport becomes the Trojan horse to the digital identification. Once people get used to the idea that they're going to have to present their vaccine passport in order to be allowed to travel to a different country, or even to travel to a different region within their own country, or even to go shopping, then it isn't a large step to say, okay, well, now we are going to implement that exact infrastructure for all access to all government services, access to leave your home, and people will be more willing to accept it.
So it seems that the COVID pandemic has opened the doors to a new era, an era in which control and surveillance are facilitated and further normalized. A digital ID, to which all our data is linked, seems to be the ultimate means to this end. One of the ways the World Economic Forum influences governments is the publication of research papers. It is common for these to be copied directly into the policy directives of governments. In 2016, the World Economic Forum published the report, A Blueprint for Digital Identity. Stakeholders worked on the research for 12 months, among them ID 2020 Alliance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, MasterCard, Visa, Deloitte, the ING Bank, and the Dutch civil service DigiD. Annie Machon is a former employee of the British intelligence agency MI5. In 1997, she and her ex-partner David Shaler became whistleblowers by lifting the veil on large-scale illegal spying by British intelligence agencies.
If we carry on going down the same path that we've become used to, and younger generations just take for granted, I think we are all going to be absolutely royally screwed, privacy-wise, human rights-wise, even democratically.
With her knowledge of data security, she fights for more privacy and security online.
What we are effectively facing to our lives online are a number of key threats. One, of course, is the intelligence agencies, the sort of state-level national actors that have this panoptic power to scoop up all our information globally. There's also the other threat from corporate spy companies. I suppose the most notorious over the last few months was something called Pegasus.
Pegasus is spyware developed by the Israeli cyber defense company NSO Group. It is capable of being remotely installed without a trace, for instance via a missed call on WhatsApp, and offers complete access to every smartphone or computer. Pegasus was used for spying on activists, journalists, and political leaders from various countries across the globe, and is still being used worldwide to this day.
And then I think the third vulnerability for us when it comes to privacy, we the people living our lives online, would be what I call the data farming, the data harvesting, which is what the big corporations do. They monetize our data. I mean, most people are aware of that aspect. But the sheer extent of how that can be micromanaged and microanalyzed, I think has only become more obvious to some people over the last few years.
In March 2018, the social media platform Facebook landed itself in hot water after sharing its users' personal data on a large scale. In collusion with British political consultancy Cambridge Analytica, the personal data was used to manipulate the 2016 US presidential elections and the Brexit referendum, with highly specific targeting and misinformation.
Tonight, Mark Zuckerberg once again facing skeptical lawmakers, pushing him on Facebook's failure to protect its users' private information.
It seems as though you turned a blind eye to this, correct?
Congressman, I disagree with that assessment.
Never before in history had personal data been abused on such a large scale. And so authorities agreed that this should never happen again.
The other issue around the spies and the corporate spies is they can't even protect their cyber weapons that they used to do their spying with, which means that they can fall into the dark web and be used by criminal hackers. So you have a situation where even the CIA and the NSA cannot protect their own classified information. And that's why I would suggest that things like digital ID is counterintuitive to everything I've been talking about for the last 25 years. Because effectively what we're doing is we're handing over, for convenience, the concept of our personal identity. You can just plug into all your government services and they say it's going to be private, but can they guarantee it? Because who is going to own the hardware on which it's stored? Who is going to run the software which runs it and organizes it? Who is going to own the infrastructure, even the fiber optic cables going across the Atlantic or across the Pacific? So I don't trust our governments or our institutions to be savvy enough to protect that sort of very private information, which will be our whole scope of us online, and do it in a meaningful manner.
Privacy is an important aspect of our online security. But as soon as money is linked to the digital ID, it becomes a completely different story. Because if it were possible to exclude people from the payment systems, then this could be abused as the ultimate means of control. Then a so-called social credit system doesn't seem so far off. Since late 2020, more than 100 central banks worldwide, among them the ECB and Federal Reserve, have started extensive research into the development of a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. A digital currency issued by the central banks. In countries including Canada, France, Saudi Arabia and China, pilot projects have already started. And in Jamaica and the Bahamas, the CBDC is already being issued.
The idea is that you get rid of cash. You have, fully digital means of payments, and there are ways to, give people who don't have smartphones access to digital means of payments. Technology-wise, all of this is currently being developed. So it's a matter of time before we see, those coming into reality.
It's a control grid that will permit them to run things centrally with AI and software, and attacks without representation. And if they get their way, they will destroy not only all national sovereignty, they'll destroy all individual sovereignty.
In an attempt to end the blockades in Ottawa, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau used an ultimate means of power, the Emergency Act from 1988. This enabled the government to block the bank accounts of the truckers and their sponsors. Canadians perceive this action as a power grab by a totalitarian government. Due to heavy criticism, Trudeau was eventually forced to unfreeze the accounts. But it did show that even in a Western democracy, the digital financial system can be used as a far-reaching means of control.